Get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid. I'm sitting here having coffee, having just awakened from a nap, seriously, 10 minutes ago. Yeah, I know it's November, and I'm still wearing part of my Halloween costume, because it's always Halloween around here, for one thing. Number two, it's just a shirt I happened to have on when I laid down to take a nap. I slept coma deep sleep for about 30 minutes. But then these daggone winds of November, they woke me up, they tricked me. I awakened to what sounded like pouring rain, and I thought, oh no, my log splitter is uncovered, because after I got a bit of a rest, it's had a long day. We're in town running errands and everything. The plan was to cut and split some firewood till about dark. And so I ran outside and I saw that it was not raining. It's a little overcast and cloudy, as you can tell, but it was the little twirly bird seeds from poplar trees blowing everywhere. These winds of November have whipped up, and these were falling and hitting the tin roof of the house. The porches have tin roofs, and the kitchen and dining room has tin roofs. Sounded like rain. Whew. Still half asleep. Speaking of half, I mentioned this is part of my Halloween costume sent by the hired family. Thanks again. The other half of my Halloween costume this year was just a hockey mask. We went into town to do some trick-or-treating, and I'm very festive. I love that holiday. It's my favorite holiday of the year, so I wore this shirt and I wore that mask, and people would be like, what are you supposed to be? And I was like, I'm supposed to be dressed up for Halloween. And they were like, yeah, but what are you? I was like, I'm dressed up for Halloween. All right, get my 6 and let's get to the story. Sounds like they're waiting. Sounded like a scream and a tree knock. So, since I was in town all day, and then took this very impromptu nap because I was exhausted, and then woke up when I didn't really want to, and realizing I'm racing daylight here, I want to get this wood split, but I also wanted to come up here and tell you guys a story. I'm just going to go to the old go-to and read it out of Bigfoot Sasquatch Files, Anthology 1, Volumes 1 through 10. Available on Amazon. And somebody mentioned they live in Canada, and they were upset because I don't ship to Canada on Etsy. Well, Amazon does. So you can get it on Amazon and print or Kindle, or if you're in the US, on Etsy. Links in the description box below. But ironically, I have chosen to read a story for you that comes to us by way of Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Volume 6, called Winds of November. Mostly because of how the wind blew these little whirly birds onto the house, and I came out and I saw the trees up there whipping again, and I thought, there's something unique about November here in this area, and something very this whole thing started really on one November night, just a few months after we had been in this house. So I'm going to read you the story now with no further ado, as my beautiful bride dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say. Winds of November. The scariest night we ever spent in our house so far was the first. It's been 4 years ago now. Well, now it's been 5. This was written over a year ago. And I'll never forget it. We'd finally gotten everything we'd been wanting for the longest time, and we had no idea just how frightening that would be. Silence. Total. We'd only recently moved to the U.S., Central Virginia to be exact, from the Philippine Islands, where we'd spent our last 6 months in the capital city of Manila, close to the U.S. Embassy, so that the second my now wife's fiancé visa was granted, we could jump on the next plane to the U.S., which we did. While there, we lived in a nice condo on the 33rd floor of a 70-story high skyscraper right in the middle of the city. And despite the height, all we heard all day and all night was the honking of horns, the screeching of brakes and tires, and the shouts and screams of people. All we saw were lights, and more lights at night, and smog, and more smog by day. It made us long for a place out in the middle of nowhere where there were no people, and where there was no smog, and where there were no noises other than the noises of nature. After having made it to the U.S. and spending a few months in an apartment complex nearly as rambunctious as Manila, we finally found our little homestead out in the middle of nowhere. We bought it, and the dream had been achieved. And that first night, again, was absolutely terrifying. I grew up in the mountains of Appalachia, and all I'd ever known for the first quarter century of my life was silence at night, and mostly by day, once you got off the well-beaten path, that is. You hear these winds of November back here? You see those treetops swaying? Tell you, stuff can sneak around in these conditions, and if you're not watching and listening for it specifically, you'll miss it. So make sure you continue to get my 6. But that was years ago. I left Appalachia and I spent time in places like Seattle and then on to Iraq, yes, a war zone, and then the Philippines. Somehow, and though it drove me crazy at first, I'd gotten used to the noises of the city, the combat zone, and both the rural and urban jungles of Southeast Asia. I'd forgotten the peace and tranquility of those beautiful country nights, though after years away from them, I longed for them, and yet when I got them back, well, we've discussed this. No need to be redundant. I know, too late. I remember that first night, lying in bed. It was a brand new king-size bed that we'd had custom made for our new home. Well, new to us. It's nearly 120 years old, one of the last sharecropper houses built in the U.S. just before the Industrial Revolution would come along and change the landscape of the world economy, and with it, the world's way of living. My wife was on the opposite side of the bed that night, and our son, only 5 years old at the time, was sleeping in between us. Neither my wife nor my son had any problem falling asleep that first night. Not only had we spent the entire weekend moving our belongings from our apartment 20 miles away in the city, it took a few trips and 2 days of work, but our son had started kindergarten just a couple of weeks before. It was September. And we'd just gone through the jumping through hoops bullshit with his school in order for them to allow him to attend. You see, when we had our apartment in the city, we were in one of the overcrowded, understaffed city school districts. But where our house is located, we're in the most privileged school district in the county. Many of the kids who attend this school come from the families of trust babies and celebrities, and the school, though public, is better than most expensive private schools in the U.S. It's a huge part of the reason we bought our house where we did. This is so ironic. Right now, my kid's school's calling. That's why I looked up. I saw something on the screen. It's the school calling with some announcement. They'll leave a voicemail, and I'll listen to it later. They have excellent communication with the parents. Just a bunch of hoops you have to jump through to get in. You're going to hear about it. We finally stood on one leg long enough while rubbing our bellies with one hand and patting our heads with the other, after having given the principal a notarized copy of our real estate contract showing we were closing on our house in his school district only 2 weeks after the beginning of the school year, and permission for our son to attend the school was finally granted. It was an emotionally exhaustive process to go through, while also going through the emotional process of buying a house, all while going through the physically draining process of moving from our apartment to our house only 3 months after having moved 9,000 miles away from the Philippines to Virginia. Ugh. Whew, man, this is an exhaustive period of time. But despite this, and being plenty exhausted myself, I could not sleep. It was too quiet, far too quiet, and my mind began playing tricks on me. In Mosul, Iraq, where I was stationed, our team ran night missions and we tried to sleep during the day. Tried being the key word here. It was difficult, as our base, Diamondback it was called, was right in the center of the city, and our enemies who lived in the city would lob mortars at us all day, trying to kill us while we tried to sleep, and their attempts to keep us from coming out at night. Just like the Diamondback rattlesnakes that we were. Eventually, by about halfway through the deployment, we were all on trazodone, which I equate to a horse tranquilizer, because trust me, once you take it, you are knocked the F out for the next 8 hours. It allowed us to sleep through the barrage of mortars that never stopped the entire time we were there. And you think that sleep in the middle of the jungle in the most remote locations of the Philippines after that would be easier, but it was actually harder. You see, many Filipinos love to sing, especially when they're drunk, and there are these little karaoke bars all over the islands. And by bars, I mean just these little bamboo shacks where the proprietor is one of the few in the village fortunate enough to be able to afford electricity, allowing them to purchase or lease a karaoke machine that the locals pay 1 peso, about 2 cents in US money, to sing a karaoke song. And they do this until 3 a.m. with the volume on high, and the entire village gets to hear it all. And then at 5 a.m., the morning vendors start roaming through the villages screaming at the top of their lungs what it is they're selling. Ista, ista, the fish vendors yell. Gulay, gulay, the vegetable vendors yell. And sleep, at least for Westerners not accustomed to such behavior, becomes as elusive as, well, for the lack of a better comparison, Bigfoot Sasquatch. But as I lay in that brand new, overpriced, custom-made king-size bed that first night in our new house on our Virginia homestead, my mind got the better of me and it kept me from sleep. At least in Iraq, when I heard the mortars, I knew who or what was out there. A bunch of people trying to kill me. When I was in the Philippines, as loud as it was out in the jungles at night, I knew what was out there. Drunken locals crucifying Bon Jovi and Journey, little old men with slimy eats from the sea and their little old wives selling the products of their labor from their gardens. And even in Manila, I'd learned to differentiate the sound of a taxi cab's horn and that of a jeepney. But here, in central Virginia, where there wasn't a street light for 20 miles, there could be anything out there just on the other side of the walls of our house, and it could be creeping up on our house, and it could even be peering into the windows of our house, and we would have no way of knowing because it was so freaking dark. Let me tell you, on a moonless and starless night out here, it's like pitch black, and I love it now. I'd forgotten how dark it gets at night when there are no artificial lights. I'd forgotten how quiet it is where there are no bombs, no horns, or drunken locals or vendors. Sure, I could hear the frogs in the pond in the front yard, and it was a welcome sound, and I could hear the crickets chirping, and their presence was welcome as well, but when both would go silent, and then a floorboard would creak as the house settled, or the tin roof would pop as it cooled in the night after having baked in the sun all day, I was out of bed, on my feet, and walking around to investigate with an aluminum baseball bat in my hands. Eventually, and just a few nights later, I would finally accept the fact that I was where I was, and this is how the nights were where I was, and it's what I'd wanted, and not to fear it, but to embrace it. In a word, I began sleeping like a baby by the end of the first week in our new, to us, house until November, when the winds of November came and brought something ominous and fearsome with them. We settled into our new routine in our new home on our new land relatively quickly. A lot of it simply had to do with the fact that we were worn out from our topsy-turvy life of the past year. I'd spent 6 months alone in the U.S. getting Dearly's visa. We'd moved my family back in the Philippines 3 times during that time after getting word of kidnapping plots on my son in hopes of hefty ransoms. And then I'd gone back, stayed with my family in Manila for 6 months before coming to the U.S. together, and then renting for 3 months, appeasing the powers that be in the public school system, and then finally settling down on our homestead after moving in. It was literally our 8th move in a year. This is counting another time we moved while living in Manila, simply because my wife had picked a real crap hole of a place to live there, right across from the Mall of Asia, before I'd flown back to live with her and our son. It was a small room about the size of a closet, the typical type of living arrangements made by many of the service workers in the area who work 12 hours a day and merely need a small space to sleep when not working. This was not good for us, by my standards, so I'd moved us to Makati City, the most high-end part of Manila, and we quite enjoyed our stay there for the 5 months we were there after having spent a month in the broom closet. Though settled, we were still quite busy. Our son's school was nearly half an hour's drive away from our property, and we were taking him there in the mornings and going and picking him up in the afternoons. Yes, there is a bus, and yes, he does ride it these days, but it took us that first year to get over the idea of someone constantly trying to kidnap him for ransom, so we were not about to let him out of our sight. True story. It took us a while to settle in here and readjust to the different culture. People are like, why you drive so far? Take your son, you got a bus. It's like, yeah, you didn't have somebody trying to kidnap your kid for ransom the first 5 years of his life. And they were like, whatever. When we get home from picking him up from school in the afternoons, we'd often lay on air mattresses out in the lawn underneath one of our many walnut trees for shade because it was still September and then October, and in our part of Central Virginia, it is still quite hot that time of year. We would lay together, the three of us, and stare into our fields, which are now meadows and quickly on their way to becoming a forest, and watch the deer and the rabbits. We've seen the occasional bear and turkey. So many hawks fly above our place regularly, you'd think it was a bird of prey preserve, and there are far too many gray squirrels to count. Often on these first afternoons at our new home, and it was finally our home after all those years of moving around due to poverty and safety, we would fall asleep in the field on our air mattress and wake up just in time to go inside, have dinner, and then fall asleep for the night in our bed. Then, as if the winds had a calendar, just as it turned November 1, a few minutes after midnight, the winds whipped up something fierce, as they'd say here in the South, and my feeling of peace left, and I was right back to where I'd been that first week in our home. You see, as our land lay, and as the land around it lies, it makes for the perfect scenario for heavy winds. There is a small river down the road and over the hill from our property. It's about 200 yards away. And all the land beside the road, once passing our property, is wooded. Our land is the first open land in the immediate area. It was formerly hayfields. So when the temperatures begin dropping drastically in November and the water's temperature is actually higher than the air temperature around it, it creates a draft. And since the land around the river, except for the road, is all wooded, the easiest way for the draft to escape and rise, as warm air does, is to come up the road. Then, once these warm drafts reach our property, they go batshit crazy because they have the space. The winds, FYI, wind is defined as a result of the uneven heating and cooling of the Earth's surface, in case you didn't know. Most people don't know, so I thought I'd tell you. They then whip around like crazy on our 6 acres. It's as if they run around playing tag with each other until they spin themselves out. Our old house has beautiful old eaves that hang over each window. They're angled perfectly for keeping the sun's direct shine out of the windows during the summer, but they allow for it to shine in during winter. These were necessary when the house was built back in 1903 because air conditioning at the time was a fantasy at most, as was heating systems outside of wood stoves and fireplaces. Neither had been invented yet. These days, the eaves are not necessary, but we leave them because it helps our old house look more rustic. We feel like we're living in an antique, which I guess we are. The house is listed on the historical registry here in Virginia. Anyway, the point to all this is that those winds on that first night of November reached our property and then our house. They lifted these eaves above the windows, at least the ones upstairs, and then as the winds passed on, the eaves would drop back into their natural place, and it sounded as if someone was jumping around in the upstairs bedrooms of our house. When this first happened, I woke with a start, immediately believing I was back in Mosul, Iraq, and that another SVBID, suicide vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, had rammed into the gate, killing all the guards and making a hole for an insurgent attack. I sat up and I reached to the side of my bed to grab my M4, but alas, it was not there. I jumped up, ready to find it, and that's when I saw my wife and our son sleeping in our custom-made king-size bed, and I remembered where I was. And then it happened again. Another slam from upstairs convinced me someone was in the house. I may not have had my M4 ready by my bed, but I did have an aluminum baseball bat that I kept there to this day for such events, or that I keep there to this day for such events. For some reason, I've had a couple people out this way ask me if I have firearms. I have no idea why I was asked this at first, but I've since come to believe that they asked this because they are anti-gun types. Yes, I'm out in the country, but it is right outside of a university town, and there are tons of those types here. And they wanted to judge me as a gun nutter had I said yes. I did not answer their question, and I will not answer it here. But what I told them was exactly where my bedroom window was located, and I challenged them to come climbing through it at 2 a.m. some night and find out. They both, 2 different beta males on 2 separate occasions, simply turned and walked away and never came back. And thank God for small favors. Anyway, I took my bat and I headed upstairs. I heard the slams a couple more times on my way up. They were coming from our son's room. He hadn't actually moved into his room yet, because allowing him to sleep with us that first year here, even though he was already in kindergarten, was part of our cooling down process as well. Let me tell you, when you have to spend the first 5 years of your kid's life worrying about them being kidnapped for ransom because their father is a white foreigner living in a non-white third world country riddled with terrorists and common criminals, old habits are hard to break. However, we since have, and it's a really nice feeling being able to let our guards down just a bit. The door to my son's room was open, and though the light was off, I could still see into the room quite well. We had not hung the blinds yet, and the moon happened to be almost full that night, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. So the light from the moon was coming through the windows, lighting the place up almost as if it were day. As I was looking out the window, a gust picked up and slammed the eave again, and this time I saw the actual movement of the eave, and I heard and felt the resulting slam, and I was immediately set to ease. I laughed at myself as I lowered the baseball bat from my shoulder, but then I immediately raised it again. As I was peering outside the window, I saw something large scurry around the side of our detached garage, which sits outside and below the window. And what I'd seen was no animal on all fours. What I'd seen just for a moment was walking upright on 2 legs, and it was big, very big. I didn't go to the window, knowing that I was far enough away from the window so that I could see out of it, but if anyone or anything was outside looking in, they could not see me. If I were to get close to the window, whoever or whatever was out there would be able to see me. I stood motionless for a minute, and realizing a drawn bat would be of no use to someone or something outside the window, I lowered it again, but I remained vigilant. A couple more minutes passed, during which time the eave outside the window banged and slammed a couple of more times, and then I saw it again. Actually, 2 of them. I could not believe what I was seeing at first, and I actually did move to the window this time to get a better view. What I saw completely blew my mind, and it would take me nearly a year to come to accept what it was that I saw, though I have to admit that at the time, I believe I already knew. At first there was only one large, and I mean really large, creature walking on 2 legs away from the back of the detached garage and up the hill of what was then our upper field. It had recently been cut for hay, and we'd allowed the man who'd taken the hay from our land for years, the land had belonged to his mother's cousin before we bought it, take one last cut before using the land exclusively for our own purposes. This man was, and still is, a local D-bag. I'll use a real word here, caught that one on the fly. And my immediate instincts told me at the time that it was this very man, the annoying neighbor that I would eventually have to run off with a crayon, that I was seeing outside that night. I believed he was stalking us, because he actually did for a while, and that he was outside being a peeping Tom, which he'd been fired from the University of Virginia for being, I would later find out. And I was about to run out the back door and give him a good old-fashioned Appalachistanian hillbilly ass-whooping. But then, the first creature was joined by a second. This one, just a bit smaller, but it was still massive in size. It occurred to me that these creatures were not men. They were not human, though they appeared to take human form, that is, as long as you consider professional NFL tight ends and WWE wrestlers. They had to be nearly 8 feet tall, and if I were a betting man, which I'm not, because I've always been too good at math to gamble or play the lottery, I would wager they weighed close to 800 pounds. I watched in awe as these 2 entities, slowly and methodically, while looking back on occasion, made their way to the top of the hill, actually this hill where we're sitting here, while looking back, top of the hill, about 400 yards away, before slipping into the woods behind my house. I rubbed my eyes a few times as they made their way up the hill, and I even pinched myself once, and sure enough, I was fully awake, as I would remain the rest of the night, despite the winds of November finally dying down and the ceasing of the banging of the eaves. And with the ceasing of the banging of the eaves. As I lay in bed the rest of the night, I questioned my sanity. I mean, I knew I was messed up a bit from the war. I knew I was messed up due to my time in the Philippines and the events that took place there. I knew I had issues due to personal losses resulting from both. But I knew I wasn't crazy. Well, that much. But I knew what I'd seen. It would take more experiences like this one, and it would later take confirmation from some really supportive and credible people on a YouTube channel, this one, we now have that did not exist at that time, that first fall that we were in our new home on our new property, But today I have every reason to believe I know exactly what I saw, and only for the first time on that November night when I'd been awakened by the winds of November. Potentially 2 Bigfoot Sasquatch. The end. So if you like that story, there's 800 pages and 3 pounds worth of more with Bigfoot Sasquatch Files volume, Anthology 1, volumes 1 through 10. Or you can just keep coming back to this channel, and I hope to just bring you one daily, orally, not from this necessarily. Hopefully I'll wake up in time next time to think of something else. But I got to go see if I can get some wood cut up and split now. I got about an hour of daylight left, so see you for more next time.